The 36 cuts 36 times. That was how often Bumpy Johnson's blade struck its mark in a single Harlem restaurant brawl. By cut 12, Ulysses Rollins was already done. By cut 24, he had been left permanently blind. By cut 36, 200 witnesses were too afraid to even breathe. Then Bumpy did something no one saw coming. He stood, straightened his tie, stepped over the body as if it were nothing more than a puddle, and told the waiter he wanted spaghetti. This wasn't just a fight. It was a statement, and everyone in Harlem understood it. Summer of 1935. Harlem, New York. If you walked down Lenox Avenue that year, you could sense the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. The streets were claimed by two forces on the verge of collision. On one side stood Dutch Schultz, the German Jewish gangster who controlled half of New York's underworld. He wanted Harlem's numbers racquetball of a tan. He didn't care how many black bodies he had to step over to get it. On the other side was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a 30-year-old enforcer who had already built a reputation as Harlem's most dangerous man. He worked for Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the brilliant numbers queen who had built an empire from nothing. And Bumpy had made her a promise. Harlem stays black, no matter what. Dutch Schultz had already sent dozens of men into Harlem. Bumpy and his crew of 9 had been taking them out one by one. It was easy, his wife would later write, since there were so few white men walking through Harlem during the day. But Schultz was growing desperate. He needed someone who could deal with Bumpy Johnson, someone without fear, someone who could meet Bumpy's violence with violence. That's when he called Chicago. Ulysses Rollins stood 6'2", 240 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. He had killed 11 men before turning 25. In Chicago, they called him the Bull because once he charged, there was no stopping him. Schultz paid him $5,000 up front and promised another $10,000 if he could remove Bumpy Johnson. Make it loud, Schultz told him. Make it public. I want every numbers runner in Harlem to know what happens when they resist. Rollins arrived in Harlem on Tuesday. By Thursday, word was already spreading. Dutch Schultz's new enforcer was in town. Kenny was hunting Bumpy. But what Rollins didn't understand about Harlem was this. In Bumpy's neighborhood, the streets had eyes. The shoeshine boys, the newspaper vendors, the women selling flowers on street corners, they all worked for Bumpy. By Friday morning, Bumpy knew Rollins was there. He knew which hotel he stayed in. He knew what he ate for breakfast. He knew Rollins carried a .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster and a knife in his boot. And Bumpy knew one more thing. Rollins was watching him that Friday night. Bumpy had a date not with a Harlem girl, but with Helen Lawson, a senior editor and film critic at Vanity Fair. Helen was white, refined, and educated at Vassar College. She reviewed Broadway shows and interviewed movie stars. She was also fascinated by Bumpy Johnson. They had met 3 weeks earlier at a jazz club. Helen had been researching an article on the Harlem Renaissance. Bumpy had been intrigued by this white woman who wasn't afraid to sit in a black club, who asked thoughtful questions, who saw Harlem as more than crime and poverty. Dinner at the Alhambra, Bumpy suggested. Best jazz in Harlem, and the food isn't bad either. Helen said yes. The Vanity Fair, date, the Alhambra Bar and Theater on the corner of 126th Street and 7th Avenue was Harlem royalty. Duke Ellington had played there. Billie Holiday had sung there. On Friday nights, the place was packed with 200 people, musicians, hustlers, intellectuals, everyone who mattered in Harlem. Bumpy arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a burgundy tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His fedora sat at the perfect angle. He looked like a banker, not a killer. Helen was already seated at the table. She wore a blue dress and pearls. They ordered drinks. Conversation flowed easily. She asked about his childhood in Charleston. He asked about working at a magazine where she was one of only 3 women. The jazz quartet played softly in the background. The mood was perfect. Then the door opened. Ulysses Rollins stepped inside. Bumpy noticed him instantly. The way Rollins moved, shoulders squared, eyes sweeping the room like a predator, told Bumpy everything he needed to know. This wasn't a man coming for dinner. This was a man searching for a mark. Their eyes locked across the crowded room. Rollins smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who had found his prey. Helen noticed Bumpy's posture shift. The easy gentleman she'd been talking to was gone. Something colder had taken his place. "Bumpy," she asked, "is something wrong?" "No," Bumpy said quietly, never looking away from Rollins. "Everything's fine. Excuse me for a moment." Rollins moved through the tables deliberately, slowly, making sure everyone saw him. This was the execution Schultz had paid for. When he reached Bumpy's table, he stopped. Rollins stood. Bumpy remained seated. The power imbalance seemed obvious, at least to Rollins. "You Bumpy Johnson?" he asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Depends on who's asking." Dutch Schultz sends his regards. Says you've been a problem. Says problems need solving, but conversations around them faded. People sensed what was coming. "Tell Dutch," Bumpy said calmly, "that Harlem already solved its problem with him. He just doesn't know it yet." Rollins laughed. Big talk for a man sitting down. That's when Bumpy saw it. Rollins's hand drifted toward his jacket, toward the pistol in his shoulder holster. Bumpy decided then, if Rollins pulled that gun, people would die. Innocent people, Helen, the musicians, the waiters. Bullets didn't choose targets in a crowded room. The restaurant confrontations, so Bumpy struck first. It happened so fast, most people missed the beginning and only saw the result. Bumpy's hand didn't reach for Rollins, it went to the table. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the steak knife beside his plate. The blade was 6 inches long, serrated, sharp enough to cut bone. Rollins saw the movement and went for his gun, but Bumpy was already in motion. He launched up from his chair with an inhuman speed. The chair crashed backward. Helen gasped as Bumpy drove the knife forward. The first cut sliced across Rollins's forearm as he drew his pistol. The gun hit the floor. The second cut split Rollins's cheek. By the third cut, Rollins understood he wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting something else, something that flowed like water and struck like lightning. They slammed into a nearby table. Glasses shattered. Food flew through the air. People screamed and scattered. But Bumpy didn't stop. Cut 4. Cut 5. Cut 6. Rollins tried to fight back. He was bigger, stronger, but Bumpy was faster. Every time Rollins swung, Bumpy slipped a punch, and the knife found flesh. Cut 12 caught Rollins across the ribs. Cut 18 split his shoulder. By cut 24, Rollins was on his knees, and that's when Bumpy went for the eyes. In the chaos, Helen had backed away from the table, pressed against the wall with other terrified patrons, but she couldn't look away. She watched Bumpy Johnson, the man who had been discussing Langston Hughes' poetry 5 minutes earlier, methodically dismantle someone twice his size. The knife was an extension of Bumpy's hand. Every movement was precise, controlled. This wasn't rage. This was arithmetic. Cut 25 struck above Rollins's left eye. The blade went deep. When Bumpy pulled back, Rollins's eyeball came with it, destroying his vision. The damage, brutal and permanent. Rollins screamed a sound Helen would hear in her nightmares for years. The restaurant went dead silent. Even the jazz quartet stopped. 200 people stood frozen, watching something that felt ripped from a horror story. Bumpy rose. Rollins was still on the floor, bleeding, his face a mask of red. He was conscious, but shattered, whimpering, and Bumpy, covered in blood that wasn't his, did something no one expected. He leaned down and straightened his tie. The calm of it, the deliberate neatness, sent a chill through every person in the room. He had just ruined a man. and he was adjusting his clothes as if he'd finished a meeting. Then Bumpy stepped over Rollins' knot around him. Over him, like Rollins, was nothing more than a puddle in his path. He returned to the table where his chair lay on its side. He set it upright, sat down. Helen stood by the wall, staring at him. Bumpy looked up and smiled. It's the same charming smile he'd given her when she arrived. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. His voice was perfectly even, as if nothing had happened. He glanced around for their waiter. The man was pressed against the bar, white-faced with shock. "Excuse me?" Bumpy called out. "Could we get some menus? I seem to have worked up an appetite." The waiter didn't move. Nobody moved. Bumpy reached over, picked up a menu from a nearby table, and studied it for a moment. Then he looked at Helen. "You know what?" he said. "I suddenly have a taste for spaghetti and meatballs." The waiter, hands trembling, finally took the order. The restaurant remained still. "Everyone wants." Helen slowly made her way back to the table. Her legs felt like water. She sat across from Bumpy, who calmly wiped blood from his hands with a napkin. "You should go," Bumpy said quietly. "This isn't a place you need to be." But Helen couldn't move. She was in shock, but she was also watching something she had never seen before. A man who had just committed extreme violence, sitting as if he were waiting for morning coffee. 8 minutes later, the spaghetti arrived. The same trembling waiter set the plate in front of Bumpy. Steam rose from the pasta. In the dim light, the red sauce looked almost black. Through the windows, Helen saw an ambulance pull up. Medics rushed in to collect Ulysses Rollins, who was still on the floor, still breathing, barely conscious. Bumpy picked up his fork. He twirled the pasta slowly, deliberately, and took a bite. Helen watched, unable to look away. He didn't eat fast like someone proving a point. He ate casually, like he was actually enjoying himself. "It's good," Bumpy said, glancing up at her. "You should eat something." Helen looked at her plate, knocked aside during the fight. She couldn't imagine eating. Her stomach was twisted tight. But Bumpy took 3 more bites, each one calm, each one a statement. By the time the medics loaded Rollins onto a stretcher, Bumpy had finished half the plate. The police arrived as Bumpy set down his fork. By then, the ambulance had already taken Ulysses Rollins to Harlem Hospital. He would live, but he would never see out of his left eye again. The cops knew better than to arrest Bumpy Johnson. Half of them were on his payroll. The other half knew that in Harlem, Bumpy was the law. "Self-defense," one officer wrote in his report. Victim drew weapon first. Multiple witnesses confirmed by Saturday morning the story had spread through Harlem like wildfire. Not just the violence. Harlem had seen violence, but the way Bumpy ended it. The spaghetti. That detail turned into legend. Men told their sons. Women told their daughters. That's how Bumpy Johnson handled business school as ICE, even with blood on his hands. By noon, the story reached Dutch Schultz. Schultz sat in his office at the Harmony Social Club in the Bronx when his lieutenant entered. White-faced boss. "Rollins is in the hospital. Bumpy Johnson cut him to pieces in a restaurant. Took his eye out." Phils set his cigar down. "Is Rollins dead?" "No." Then he failed. Schultz stood and walked to the window. "You know what the problem is? We keep thinking we can intimidate these Harlem boys. We keep thinking if we send someone bigger, meaner, stronger, they'll back down. So what do?" He stayed quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would shift the course of mob history. "We leave Harlem alone." "What?" "You heard me. Bumpy Johnson just sent a message. And the message is Harlem is not for sale. We've lost 40 men trying to take that neighborhood. 40. And Johnson isn't even breathing hard." Schultz turned back to his lieutenant. "Call Lucky Luciano. Tell him we need a sit-down. Tell him we need to make a deal with Bumpy Johnson." 6 months later, Dutch Schultz would be dead, killed on orders from Lucky Luciano. And Bumpy would negotiate the deal that made him the godfather of Harlem. The first black man to sit at the table as an equal with the Italian mafia. But that Friday night in 1935 at the Alhambra restaurant, Bumpy was just a man having dinner, a man who ordered spaghetti while another man's blood was still wet on the floor. After the police left, Helen asked Bumpy to take her home. She couldn't stay in that restaurant another moment. The smell of spaghetti sauce mixed with blood made her feel sick. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Bumpy said as they stepped into the Harlem night. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That man came to kill you." "Yes, and you knew he was going to." "Yes, so the whole dinner was what? A trap." Bumpy stopped walking. He looked at Helen with something that might have been sadness in his eyes. "I didn't set a trap. I just lived my life. But when a man comes to kill you in front of innocent people, you handle it fast and you handle it final. So everyone knows what happens next time." Years later, Helen would write about that night in a memoir that was never published. She described Bumpy as the most contradictory man she had ever met: a killer who quoted poetry, a gangster who tipped his hat to old women, a violent man who carried the weight of his violence like a cross. The story of the 36 cuts became legend in Harlem. But what most people missed was this: Bumpy didn't just destroy Ulysses Rollins that night. He destroyed the idea that Harlem could be conquered by outside forces. Every mobster in New York heard the story. Every politician, every cop. And they all understood the same message: Harlem protects its own. The legend that never dies, Bumpy Johnson would go on to rule Harlem for the next 30 years. He would go to prison twice, serve time in Alcatraz, negotiate with the Italian mafia, protect Malcolm X, and become a legend. But on that summer night in 1935 at the Alhambra restaurant, with 200 witnesses watching him step over a bleeding man and order spaghetti, Bumpy Johnson taught Harlem and the world a lesson about power. Real power isn't just violence. Any thug can kill. Real power is control. It's precision. It's the ability to destroy a man and then calmly straighten your tie. It's sending a message so clear, so final, that you never have to send it again. Ulysses Rollins never returned to Harlem. In fact, he tried to kill Bumpy one more time weeks later at Frank's restaurant on 125th Street. He fired a shot that missed Bumpy but killed an innocent woman standing nearby. That was Rollins's last act as a free man. He disappeared after that. Some say Bumpy's men found him. Some say he fled back to Chicago. No one knows for sure, but everyone knows this: after that night at the Alhambra, when anyone mentioned Bumpy Johnson's name, they did it with respect, or they didn't mention it at all. Years later, an old man who had been in the restaurant that night was asked what he remembered most. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "The spaghetti. I remember thinking, this man just took another man's eye out, and he's sitting there eating pasta like it's Sunday dinner. Not pretending, actually eating it." That's when I knew. That's when we all knew. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous. He was something else. Something colder. Something you don't forget. And that's the truth about legends. They aren't born in the big moments. They're born in the small ones, in the details, in the way a man adjusts his tie, in the way he steps over a body, in the way he orders spaghetti. 36 cuts, one message, one legend. That was the night Harlem learned who Bumpy Johnson really was.